The voltage hit 14-year-old Marcus Thompson without warning, without a verbal command to stop or put his hands up, without any attempt at de-escalation or communication. Just the sudden electric shock that sent his body convulsing to the airport floor while his backpack flew from his hands and his phone skittered across the polished tile. The airport security officer stood over him with the taser still extended, his voice booming with false authority as he shouted, "Stay down! Don't move! You were acting suspiciously and failed to comply with verbal commands." But Marcus hadn't heard any verbal commands because there hadn't been any. He'd simply been walking through the terminal toward his gate, a black teenage boy in a hoodie, listening to music through his earbuds, completely unaware that he'd been flagged as suspicious by Officer Derek Sullivan, who had decided that a young black male walking with purpose and not making eye contact with authority figures must be up to something criminal. Marcus lay on the ground gasping, his body still twitching from the electrical current that had just coursed through his nervous system, tears streaming down his face from pain and shock, and the humiliation of having dozens of travelers stop to stare at him like he was a spectacle, like he was the problem, like he deserved whatever treatment he was receiving because surely airport security wouldn't use force without cause. His mother, Vanessa, who had been walking 15 feet behind him after stopping at a newsstand, came running with a scream that echoed through the terminal, and she dropped to her knees beside her son, her hands hovering over him as if afraid to touch him in case it would hurt him more. "What did you do to my baby? He's 14 years old. He was just walking to our gate. Why would you tase him?" Her voice rose with each question, panic and fury blending into something raw and primal. And Officer Sullivan's partner, a younger man whose name tag read Officer Chen, looked distinctly uncomfortable as he tried to keep the growing crowd of onlookers back. Sullivan's face had gone red, and he pointed at Marcus with his free hand while keeping the taser trained on the boy. "Ma'am, your son was exhibiting suspicious behavior. He was walking in an erratic pattern. He was wearing clothing that concealed his face, and he failed to respond to my verbal commands. I had reason to believe he might be a threat, and I used appropriate force to neutralize that threat." The words were clearly rehearsed, the kind of statement officers are trained to give that transforms their violence into policy-compliant actions. But Vanessa wasn't accepting the narrative, her voice cutting through his justifications like a blade. "He was walking to our gate. He had earbuds in, so he didn't hear you. He's a child. You tased a child without warning." She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and placed a call, and when her husband answered, she could barely get the words out through her tears. "Michael, they tased Marcus. Airport security tased our son. He's on the ground and he's hurt, and they're saying he was acting suspicious, but he was just walking. Baby, you need to get here now." What Officer Sullivan didn't know, what he would learn in approximately 3 minutes when Michael Thompson arrived at the scene, was that he'd just deployed a weapon against the son of one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country, a lawyer who had built his career on police brutality cases and who had the resources, the knowledge, and the network to ensure that this incident would have consequences that extended far beyond a simple internal review. Michael Thompson burst through the terminal crowd like a force of nature, his suit jacket flying behind him and his face showing a rage so controlled it was somehow more terrifying than shouting. And he dropped to his knees beside his son, checking his pulse and his breathing, and the burn marks where the taser probes had made contact with Marcus's skin. When he looked up at Officer Sullivan, his voice came out with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years dismantling police justifications in courtrooms across the country. "My name is Michael Thompson. I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights and police misconduct, and you just deployed a weapon against my 14-year-old son who was walking through an airport terminal, and I watched the entire thing happen from 30 feet away, so I can personally testify that there were no verbal commands, no attempt at communication, no warning before you fired, and I can also testify that my son was doing nothing except walking with earbuds in toward his gate." He stood slowly, pulling out his phone to take photographs of Marcus still lying on the ground, of the taser probes and wires, of Officer Sullivan's defensive posture, and his voice took on a different quality as he continued, speaking for the benefit of the crowd that had gathered and the multiple phone cameras now recording. My son is a straight-A student. He's never been in trouble. He was traveling with his mother to visit his grandmother, and you looked at a black teenager in a hoodie and decided he must be a threat worthy of immediate violence without even attempting verbal communication or physical approach. That's not security protocol. That's racial profiling resulting in excessive force against a minor. Sullivan's confident expression had started to crumble, and he stammered something about following his training and responding to suspicious behavior. But Michael cut him off with the kind of devastating precision that had made him legendary in civil rights circles. What specific behavior did you observe that constituted reasonable suspicion of criminal activity? Walking? Wearing a hoodie? Having earbuds in? Being black? Because I can tell you right now that none of those things, individually or in combination, justify the use of force against an unarmed child who pose no threat to anyone. By now, airport police supervisors had arrived, along with TSA management and airport administrators, all of them clearly recognizing that this situation had spiraled into something that would have significant repercussions. And a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as the airport security director approached Michael with visible anxiety. "Mr. Thompson, I cannot apologize enough for what happened here. We're going to conduct a full investigation and ensure appropriate action is taken." Michael's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Appropriate action? Your officer just committed assault with a weapon against my minor child based on racial profiling. Appropriate action isn't an internal investigation that results in a slap on the wrist and paid administrative leave. Appropriate action is criminal charges for assault, termination for violation of use of force policies, and federal civil rights charges for deprivation of rights under color of law." He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "Here's my office information. You'll be hearing from my legal team within 24 hours with a formal complaint, a demand for preservation of all security footage and officer body camera recordings, and notice of intent to file both criminal complaints and civil litigation. And because this happened in a federally regulated facility, I'll also be filing complaints with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the Transportation Security Administration." Paramedics had arrived and were checking Marcus's vital signs, and Michael watched as they examined the taser burn marks and asked his son questions about pain levels and whether he could feel his extremities. And he felt his control starting to slip as the full reality of what had happened crashed over him. His child had been violently attacked by someone in authority for no reason except racial bias. And if Michael hadn't been a civil rights attorney with connections and resources, this incident probably would have been buried with a report that justified Sullivan's actions and blamed Marcus for suspicious behavior. Officer Sullivan tried one more defense, his voice desperate now. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you're upset, but I was doing my job. I have to make split-second decisions to keep travelers safe, and sometimes those decisions aren't perfect, but they're made with good intentions." Michael turned on him with an expression that made Sullivan take an involuntary step back. "Good intentions? You tased a child. You deployed a weapon that can cause cardiac arrest, neurological damage, and psychological trauma against a 14-year-old who is doing nothing except walking through an airport terminal. Good intentions don't excuse that, and they certainly don't protect you from the consequences of your actions. So here's what's going to happen. You are going to be criminally charged with assault and battery on a minor. You're going to lose your job and your law enforcement certification. You're going to be named individually in a federal civil rights lawsuit, and every case you've ever been involved in is going to be reviewed because if you're willing to do this to my son in broad daylight with witnesses, I have to assume you've engaged in similar misconduct that was less visible." Within hours, video footage from multiple angles had been compiled and released, showing exactly what Michael had described. Marcus walking normally through the terminal, Officer Sullivan approaching from behind without any verbal warning, and the immediate deployment of the taser without any attempt at communication or physical approach. The videos went viral, sparking outrage and protests outside the airport. And within 72 hours, Officer Sullivan had been arrested and charged, the airport security director had resigned under pressure, and the Department of Justice had announced a comprehensive investigation into use of force practices at the airport that had apparently allowed this kind of violence to become normalized. Michael sat beside Marcus's hospital bed that night, watching his son sleep fitfully with bandages covering the taser burns, and he felt his control starting to slip as the full reality of what had happened crashed over him. His child had been violently attacked by someone in authority for no reason except racial bias. And if Michael hadn't been a civil rights attorney with connections and resources, this incident probably would have been buried with a report that justified Sullivan's actions and blamed Marcus for suspicious behavior. What you just witnessed wasn't just about one security officer making one bad decision. It was about a system that treats black children as threats rather than children, that authorizes violence against them with minimal justification, that trains officers to see dark skin and hoodies as reasonable suspicion of criminal activity worthy of immediate force. Marcus Thompson was walking through an airport with earbuds in, doing exactly what thousands of other travelers do every day. But Officer Sullivan looked at him and saw a threat that needed to be neutralized with a weapon, rather than a child who needed to be protected. Think about that calculation. The split-second decision that a black teenager walking with purpose deserved immediate electrical shock without any attempt at verbal communication or assessment of actual threat level. And think about how that decision reveals deeply ingrained biases about which bodies are valuable and which are disposable, which children deserve gentle treatment and which deserve violence. And Officer Sullivan's immediate justification, the claim that he'd given verbal warnings that never happened, shows how these systems protect officers who lie to cover their misconduct, how body cameras and witness testimony are often ignored in favor of officer statements that transform their violence into policy-compliant necessary force. The devastating reality is that Marcus will carry this trauma forever. Will remember the pain and the humiliation and the terror of being attacked without understanding why. Will grow up knowing that his body is seen as threatening regardless of what he's actually doing, and that knowledge will shape how he moves through the world, how much space he allows himself to take up, how carefully he has to perform non-threatening behavior just to stay safe. If this story made you feel something, if you felt protective anger when Marcus was tased and satisfaction when accountability finally arrived, then I need you to understand that this happens constantly to black children who are adultified by authority figures, who are treated as criminals before they've done anything, who experience violence that is then justified with lies about their behavior or their compliance. Share this video because it illustrates that even children aren't protected from racism, that being young doesn't shield black boys from being targeted, that the next generation is inheriting trauma from systems that see their existence as suspicious. Comment below with your own experiences or observations of children being treated as threats, of black youth being criminalized for normal behavior, of authority figures deploying violence without attempting communication or de-escalation. Subscribe if you believe that protecting black children matters, that they deserve to move through public spaces without being tased or shot or arrested for existing, that childhood should be a time of safety, not survival. And most importantly, if you witness violence against children, record it, provide witness statements, refuse to let officers lie about what happened, because your documentation can be the difference between accountability and another family traumatized by violence that gets justified and forgotten. Marcus had his father to fight for him, but every black child deserves that level of protection and advocacy, regardless of whose son they are.